okay? And that your emotions and your motivations can be pushed around by shaping your beliefs and expectations. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on in the course, but the most important aspect of this is what's known as the cognitive construction of reality. Again, that we build up in our minds a mental representation of the world around us, and it's that mental representation that determines our behavior. The second part of social cognition, and the part we're going to emphasize mostly in this course, is the cognition of social objects. Our knowledge, beliefs, and expectations about ourselves, we're social objects, okay? Other people, the situations in which we meet them, and the behavior that transpires in those situations. How do we perceive, remember, think about, communicate about social objects, how social cognition develops over the lifespan of the individual, what some of the neural bases of social cognition might be. That's where we're going to focus this course mostly, which raises a question of why would you do this? Why do you have a special course on social cognition? Why don't you just call it cognitive psychology and be done with it? Well, the reason is there are reasons for thinking that there are substantive differences between cognition of non-social objects on the one hand and the cognition of social objects on the other hand. It's a good thing I only have two hands, okay? But it raises a question of, okay, people are the objects of social cognition. Are they just objects, okay? What might make social cognition special? Or is it just the case that the same principles of cognition apply in the social domain as in the non-social domain? This course is based on the proposition that to a great extent, the same principles apply in the two domains, that you can generalize from the non-social domain to the social domain. However, there are some critical differences between non-social and social cognition that motivate special attention, like in courses like this or textbooks like Fisk and Taylor. Some of these differences are what I call quantitative differences because they're differences in degree. They're not differences in kind. It's just that social cognition is more of something than non-social cognition is. First of one of these quantitative differences is what's known as the poverty and ambiguity of the stimulus. The fact of the matter is that the information that's provided by the stimulus is often insufficient to determine perception. In order to actually perceive and interpret what's going on around you, you have to take information provided by the stimulus situation and combine it with knowledge and beliefs that you're retrieving from memory in order to construct a percept that underlies your behavior. That's true in the most boring non-social conditions possible. If any of you have taken Steve Palmer's or Dave Whitney's course on perception, you know about the fragmentary nature of the stimulus and constructive processes, even in the perceptual illusions. It's all the more so, it seems to me, in the social case. In social cognition, the stimulus is even more impoverished, even more fragmentary, more vague than in the non-social case. Moreover, we often are beset by conflicting cues. One set of cues will tell us one thing, another set of cues will tell us another thing, and again, those kinds of conflicts are more salient in the social case than in the non-social case. A third quantitative difference between social and non-social cognition has to do with the role of emotion and motivation. And just as a flat-footed statement, we'll defend it later on in the course, emotion and motivation play a particularly salient role in social cognition. How you perceive another person is going to be determined a lot about how you feel about that person, what you want to do with that person, in a way that how you perceive a blackboard or a coffee cup or something like that. Emotion and motivation just don't play that much of a role in those kinds of perceptions. Jerome Bruner, great early cognitive psychologist, brought emotion and motivation together with cognition in what was known as the new look in perception. The late Robert Abelson talked about social cognition as hot cognition, cognition that is warmed by emotion and motivation. The third quantitative difference between social and non-social cognition has to do with the role of context. What we perceive, when we perceive, is determined a lot by the context in which the stimulus occurs. That's true in the non-social domain, but it's especially true in the social domain, where the context in which some event occurs makes a big difference to our interpretation of it. Here is an example of this. This is a famous picture from September 11th, 2001. These are a group of young people sitting at the bikeway in Brooklyn, looking over the East River towards Manhattan with the Twin Towers having collapsed in the background. And there was a huge scandal about this picture when it was published because it looked like they're having a jolly old time, right? While these people are, people on the other side of the river were having quite a horrible time. There were a number of interpretations. The photographer himself said they seemed totally relaxed like any normal afternoon. They're just chattering away. It's possible they lost people and cared, but they were not stirred by it. They didn't seem to care. Frank Rich, the columnist in the New York Times, reacting to this paper, said, this is a country that likes to move on and fast. Here it is the afternoon of 9/11, and these guys are out for a sunny bike ride in the park. But David Plotz, writing in Slate magazine, had an entirely different interpretation, that these people did care. They were turning toward each other for solace and for debate. Same stimulus, same picture, very different interpretations depending on the context. Well, it turns out these guys were tracked down by an enterprising reporter, and it turned out that they were very much affected by this, and that's what they were talking about there. Just happened to catch, the photographer happened to catch them at a particular moment where somebody was smiling. But again, the context makes a big difference. Knowing what a person's intentions are makes a big difference to perception. Here is another example. You're all too young for this, but I remember this very vividly. This is Edward Muskie, senator who was running for president in 1972, who had just come out of the editorial offices of a newspaper in New Hampshire, right before the New Hampshire primary. The very conservative editorial board had treated him very badly, and he came out for a little press briefing on the steps of the New Hampshire union leader and appeared to be crying. Now, crying is not something you want to see in a presidential candidate, right? Especially in 1972. But was he crying? Was he crying because he got beaten up by this editorial board? Or, since it was snowing at the time, was what was going down his cheek melting snow, which was his claim. The stimulus is ambiguous. It's vague. It's fragmentary. You've got to bring all your knowledge and beliefs and your feelings to bear to try to figure out what you make of this picture, and how you perceive it is going to determine how you respond to it. It's the mental representation of the stimulus. The stimulus itself is vague and ambiguous. You're not too young to remember this particular one. This is known as Hillary Clinton's Muskie moment. Again, right before the New Hampshire primary, where she was talking about her supporters, and she seemed to tear up a little bit on television. Here's an exchange on Fox News. William Kristol, who's a very conservative person, said she just pretended to cry. Britt Hume, who was a reporter, said, you think she pretended? Crystal, yes. Hume, I don't. It's the same stimulus. Two entirely different interpretations of that stimulus, okay? Here is another one. This is more recent. This is a photograph, famous photograph, entitled Beirut Residents Continue to Flock to Southern Neighborhoods, taken at the time of a particularly vicious set of episodes in the Lebanese ongoing civil war. And what this looks like is a bunch of kind of yuppies out on the town doing some disaster tourism in their bright red convertible with all this mayhem around them. It looks like they don't care at all, and that was the interpretation given to this picture. Again, an enterprising reporter located these people and they said, what were you doing? And what they were doing was going back to their apartment building, which had been destroyed in a bombing, to try to salvage whatever it was they could salvage. But you don't know that from the picture. It looks like people out for a good Sunday drive, right? You know, let's go down and see the miserable people. You just don't really know. Context is going to make a big difference. Here's a very recent one. This is a famous photograph, and you want to know what's going on here. If you've watched Burt Lancaster and Deborah Kerr in From Here to Eternity, you know perfectly well what's going on here. But then you look at the whole picture. What is going on here, right? You just really have no idea what's going on here. It looks like these are two people making out in the middle of the street while a riot is going on. In fact, this picture is now known as the Vancouver Riot Kiss. It took place on the last night of the Stanley Cup Finals when the Vancouver Canucks got beaten. There was a riot in the street. These two people had been vacationing. They had come out of their hotel to kind of see what was going on and gotten tear gas. He is actually trying to help her, trying to get tear gas out of her eyes while the police and the rioters are doing their thing. But again, unless you've got this extra information, unless you bring something else to the stimulus, you have no idea what's going on. But your interpretation of the stimulus is going to make a difference in how you respond. It's your perception, not the stimulus. Even this stimulus is vague and fragmentary and ambiguous. You've got to bring all you've got to bear to make sense of it. Okay, so these are quantitative differences in degree between social and non-social perception. All perception is influenced by context. The stimulus in all forms of perception is relatively vague and fragmentary. How you perceive a coffee mug is going to depend on whether you want a cup of coffee or not. But social perception is all the more so, these things, different from non-social case. There are also some qualitative differences between social and non-social cognition, not just differences in degree, but differences in kind. One of these is related to what in neuroscience we call the doctrine of modularity. And the doctrine of modularity basically says that the brain isn't just a single general information processor, rather the brain contains a number of modules that are dedicated to performing particular kinds of information processing tasks. You might have a module for color vision, you might have a module for emotion, you might have a module for feeling hungry or whatever, that the brain is a confederation, if you will, of different parts, each performing their individual functions. It is entirely possible that there are some parts of the brain that are specifically evolved for the purposes of social cognition. Okay? If so, that there are parts of the brain that are dedicated to social cognition and other parts of the brain that are dedicated to non-social cognition, that would count as a qualitative difference between the two. Another important distinction is that in social cognition, we break down the distinction between knower and known. We break down the distinction between subject and object. When I look at that door, that's a door, right? That's there, I'm here, that's the object, I'm the subject of this perception. But if you look at yourself, for example, as an object of perception, you are both the knower and the object of knowledge. Now, that does not occur in the non-social case, okay? It's only in social cognition that you confuse the subject-object distinction in quite that way. The other really critical qualitative distinction between social and non-social cognition is that in the social case, the object of cognition is itself a sentient being, a being that has mental states of its own, a being that has knowledge and beliefs and feelings and desires and intentions, okay? So you've got an intelligent, conscious observer, you've got an intelligent, conscious object of perception. People are intelligent and conscious in a way that coffee mugs are not. Let's just put it that way. Which means that the object of perception can be trying to control the subject's perception of the object. We have in social psychology lots of examples of people trying to form impressions of other people, whereas the people they're trying to form impressions of are simultaneously trying to control the impressions they form. The great social psychologist Ned Jones, called this impression management. Okay? Sociologist Irving Goffman called this strategic self-presentation. But whatever you call it, you're trying to understand what's going on in the head of some other person. That other person is trying to control your perception of him or her so that you could, if you let yourself, get involved in an infinite series, an infinite regress. You've got a person trying to perceive an object. The object is itself an intelligent, sentient being. He knows that the person is trying to perceive him. The person knows that the object knows that the person is trying to perceive him. And the object knows that the person knows that the object knows that the person knows that you're trying to perceive him. That doesn't occur in the non-social case. So in social cognition, we are always put in the position of reading between the lines. What's he really like? What's he trying to get me to think he's like? Okay? That occurs in social cognition, occurs nowhere else, and that is one of the things that makes social cognition as interesting as it is. We'll talk more about these things later on, but that's basically the idea of the course. We're going to look at cognition from perception to language, with always in a social context, with social objects as the objects of cognition. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.